Our next speaker, Dr. Lee who is a member of our CIB committee, is director of the Brexit think tank called the Red Cell. I'm not sure if it's one of Brendan's... doesn't sound like it, though. No. The executive director of Veterans for Britain. And he's a long-standing Eurosceptic campaigner and an author, a historian. And during the referendum, he was director of special projects at Vote Leave, and with 20 years of experience in the reserve forces, and he has served in 3 overseas deployments. He'll be speaking on the risks remaining for the United Kingdom after Brexit from EU defence and security integration, and the UK remaining institutionally closely associated with it in spite of the vote. So, Lee, if you'd like to, would you like to speak from the podium? I think it's probably more comfortable. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I hope the other speakers are here, because otherwise it's going to be very lonely at the top, particularly as, tragically, straight after this I have to disappear. I'm halfway through something on the state of the economy in 1951 Britain, which, as you can imagine, was pretty grim reading. So I'd much rather be here, but there you go. Thank you for the invite, and thank you for the possibility of being here today. As I recall, the last time I was on a CIB platform was at an event outside the Bank of England as one of a number of representatives from various groups advocating that we steer clear of joining a single currency. Thankfully, we won that one, otherwise the rest of the parade would have been a bit pointless. It's in recalling that event that I hope you'll indulge me by allowing a momentary diversion. I shall come on to the issue of Brexit and EU defence shortly, but I wanted first to briefly flag up another development which you may have heard tell of in the papers. Teaming up with a number of other veterans from Eurosceptic campaigns, including CIB's own in-house superhero Jim Reynolds at the back. Hey, scattering applause there. A group of us have set in motion the first stage in the establishment of a museum of sovereignty. It will be a museum of Brexit. The idea is to capture the history of Euroscepticism, a fair chunk of which is represented by the campaigning done by people in this very room. The Brexit referendum, after all, was just one stage in a process that lasted many decades. Our leaving the EU did not happen simply because of a couple of colourful buses that sped up and down the land, iconic and even pasty-filled though they may have been. The story, in fact, stretches back much further. It takes in, as I alluded to before, the toe-to-foe fight against Tony Blair's plan to get us into the euro. It takes in the Irish and Danish referenda. It takes in Maastricht. It takes in the 1975 debate. It takes in the whole accession process too. Then, indeed, there is the wider context. We cannot understand Euroscepticism without understanding the ingredients that have gone into making parliamentary sovereignty, British globalism, and even our national identity, taken from the vantage point both of the political left and the right. Arguably, that takes us indeed back to the Reformation, the Statute of Prime Nero, the Declaration of Arbroath, Magna Carta, and even the Romans. The context is expansive and the project itself, capturing all those Brexit memories, is ambitious. Setting it up will be a long process, but we are setting it in place right now, those logs across which to drag those stones, so that we can start to accumulate the artefacts that can go on display and also form the behind-the-scenes archives and library that historians and academic researchers can use to better understand events. So I hope you will look up our project on the website, www.museumofbrexit.uk, and see what we are looking for. With the Chairman's leave, I also hope to pen a piece for the CIB newsletter in due course. But away from the broken statue of the EU Ozymandias and into the future. I want to speak today, and I won't take too long, on the current threat that stands before us on the EU army front. You have heard from our friends in the fishing community about the grave threats that hang over them, the intense uncertainty, the brooding clouds on the horizon. It pains me to say that these menacing cumulonimbi are not an isolated outcrop. There are a number of areas of the Brexit talks where, to paraphrase Lady Thatcher, Whitehall is going wobbly, or would if its corridors weren't already littered with the jelly-filled potholes. Fisheries, as you have heard, is one. Justice and Home Affairs is another, with the Home Office's addiction to European arrest warrant and Europol. Then there are a raft of EU agencies, which we risked being superglued to, 53 of them, costing 10 billion euros and employing 15,000 staff. Perhaps only 8 of them are worth associate membership on a par with Israel, and only 2 of them are of interest for deeper administrative association, and only then because of a nuclear reactor sitting in Oxfordshire that you simply can't put on the back of a truck. And then there is defence, and its sister subject, the common foreign policy. It should be of zero surprise to attendees here that the EU has ambitions in this field. It's a subject that Eurosceptics have long been semaphoring as a threat for a very long time. The EU for years has been deploying thousands of military personnel under an EU flag, both in training and also in combat missions. It's been integrating organisationally. The only reason it doesn't have a headquarters is because the UK a few months ago vetoed it being called a headquarters. It does have the basis for an intelligence establishment, though, as it does have its own satellite centre. It has an EU Institute for Security Studies, its own RUSI. It has its own defence agency, coordinating not only research, but also policy and doctrine. A parallel treaty structure has created a go-ahead group contributing to a European gendarmerie, and so on and so forth. This is not, as I say, new, nor is it unexpected. Ever since the Maastricht Treaty, the EU institutions have been given the open and legitimate authority to pursue, and I quote, the eventual framing of a common defence policy, which might in time lead to a common defence. The John Major retort, when confronted with this awkward fact, was that it was expressed in the conditional. But then again, so was everything that was raised during the EEC accession debate, when Geoffrey Howe wound up the speeches saying that the UK would have a veto on things like the single currency ever happening, so no one need ever worry. Now, you might think that Brexit will make all this irrelevant. Sadly, this is not so. And worse, because of the nature of the threat and the way that various threads are running through the tapestry, the big picture it portrays is being missed. Let me explain. The UK is committed to leaving the EU and replacing it with a deep and special partnership, quote unquote. Of itself, this is not necessarily a concern. Indeed, the vocabulary is unobjectionable. We want to be able to trade and cooperate with our friends after all. However, it's the detail which is the issue. Let's take the headline points in turn. First, there's a founding element. The EU now has a corporate defence budget called the European Defence Fund. Certain other budgets are directly and indirectly linked to this, as there is an increased intent to spend, for example, development funding in the context of a coherent international foreign policy. Even if we pull away from the EDF, if we are still attached to these other programmes, there is a risk of subsidy by osmosis. Any areas within the security domain will certainly in any case carry with them an expectation of committing to financial contributions, and not just on the standard international principle of juste retour, in other words, the expectation that financially you get back roughly what you put in. So the UK risks being once more being seen as a milch cow. An added complication also involves the European Investment Bank. The EU has made it plain, and the British government appears to have conceded the point, that the UK's withdrawal of its money from the EIB, on which, incidentally, it gets a dreadful rate of investment return, will only take place very gradually. However, EIB funds have already been earmarked to support research and development in EU military technology. So for perhaps a decade and potentially longer, UK taxpayers will be supporting the programme of EU military R&D, regardless of whether the programme in question is something UK has signed up to, or even if we are pursuing something better with the US. The business about business, if I can put it in those terms, is the second big headache. The pronunciation unfriendly EDIP is the European Defence Industrial Development Programme. The plan here is based on a sensible premise that unfortunately leads to all kinds of dangerous conclusions. Essentially, defence industries within the EU have been considered exempt from the rules and effects of the single market. They are to varying degrees protected by their respective states, and for understandable reasons. Countries, and especially larger countries, want to keep their ability to make their own military hardware because there's never any guarantee in a crisis you'll be able to order it in from abroad. The infamous example you might be most familiar with was the refusal by Belgium to sell us ammunition during the Falklands War. The downside is that collectively, these European industries have fewer economies of scale than counterparts in the United States in particular. Given that it costs a great deal of money to develop a new prototype and then build and export it, it makes an element of commercial sense for European competitors perhaps to team up or indeed for European states to be more open with procurement and let the best contractor win. Now, the UK already does the latter more than other countries to a point, and we have a track record with international cooperation going back through Typhoon to Tornado and so on, when it has suited us. The problem, however, is now that the Commission has this EDITB plan, which is about creating a single market in defence, but which also comes with wider strategic and political objectives which are quite openly admitted. It wants to reduce national building capabilities so the construction is super specialised at a small number of locations across the continent. Alarm bells on this common procurement policy should already be ringing, given the track record of every other EU common policy, which rather predicts the liberal economic win from streamlining competition won't work out as centrally planned, and political bartering between states comes to the fore. We heard earlier about how fisheries works. In practical terms, what that creates is the balloon debate question of whether you're going to close Govan Shipyard, or BAE's military research, or Yeovil's helicopter lanes. Worse, whichever one is pursued, the decision will be reached via the EU at some 2 a.m. fisheries quota-style meeting, and what is abandoned will be a defence capability that will be permanently lost to the nation state. The UK is supposed to be skirting clear of EDITB. However, the central policy underwrites it and underpins every aspect of wider EU research and procurement activity. The closer the UK remains institutionally and in policy terms to the EU's defence compass, the greater the magnetic risk to the national capability. It's as simple as that. If the UK signs up to joint programmes, they will be governed by EU defence procurement directives. They will follow CSDP guiding rules. The strategies that are set out and will give them policy direction will be made without UK participation, without UK interests at heart, by the decision-making processes and committees of the EU at strategic level. This is not, incidentally, the argument for us to get deeper into the deal in order to try and influence things more, obviously. The concept either way is one of continental rationalisation and not letting any individual countries slow things down. This then takes us to the third problem, the European Defence Agency, or EDA. The EDA is at the heart of the spider's web of defence integration. Yet the UK government is looking at signing us up to a form of association deal with it. Its role is swiftly growing in importance, not only as it assumed this at the central role in defence procurement, that is to say, acting as the institutional hub for European businesses to come together and build identical kit for European militaries, but it is also increasingly engaged on policy and tactics development too. The politics of EU defence integration is very much being driven by the logistics side of business, which is only natural given that for years the only road into defence issues by the European Commission was through pushing the envelope with a single market. And then there are all those other assets and joint programmes. The agreed plan over time is to collapse non-EU multilateral military groupings formally into the EU structures, which effectively means to get EU standing forces by the back door. The EU battle groups have in reality proven to be a disappointment for the integrationists. So with the UK leaving those, the long-term threat that now exists comes from the future shape of the arrangements we currently have bilaterally with, for instance, the Dutch Marines, or with a multitude of countries, including the French with the Air Group. Quite how closely the UK will fit with the EU's other ambitious expansion elements are also dangerously unclear. We may yet steer clear of SATCEN, the EU's spy satellite centre, but questions remain over other programmes relating to future intelligence coordination. The fact that we are apparently heading towards signing up to so much of the Justice and Home Affairs agenda is a very poor marker. The Home Office has a pretty dreadful record in robustly wielding the national veto in this domain that inspires less confidence than a Russian paramedic in Salisbury. Despite our opt-outs and opt-ins, the UK has signed up to roughly a third of the JHA agenda. The other opt-out state, Denmark, over the same period, signed up to just a couple of %. And even now has decided, while still an EU member, to take a big step away from Europol, the EU's self-proclaimed FBI. So, you'll see from all that there is a lot going on. The problem is that Whitehall is eyeing staying quite close in some areas and applying docking ports in other areas. Yet the principles driving ever closer defence union, which now takes the form of policies, institutions and coherent, cohesive plans, run like a constant thread throughout. By pursuing a close level of association, ministers are green-lighting those in Brussels who push the integrationist agenda. Whitehall's myopia fails to spot the wider strategic threat that follows, both to UK national capabilities and also the viability of a polarised NATO and the undermining of US confidence and trust in the UK as the only European power with which it shares its deep intelligence. The strategy and its motives are truly baffling. The UK is in a position of considerable relative strength in these fields, yet this is being casually given away by, I have to say, it looks like a rather amateurish Cabinet Office team. In a speech, rather unfortunately chosen to be given in that ill-omened city of Munich, it assured counterparts the UK gave an quote-unquote unconditional commitment to European security. There is a peculiar perception in parts of the civil service that extensive support by this country in defence and home affairs, to use the terminology an arrangement that builds on the depth and breadth of our existing security arrangement from foreign and defence policy to law enforcement and criminal justice cooperation, must be a given because security is an issue of common national interest. This is a particularly foolish proposition on two counts. In the first, it endorses the model of cooperation rather than the principle. In the second, developing a free trade area with limited economic barriers is also, self-evidently, an issue of common national interest. But I don't see the Commission taking that truth just as seriously. And so we need to reciprocate, to play hardball, to negotiate like we understand the meaning of the term. We need to deploy our world champion Cotswold shin kickers. Other countries have been doing it for decades. Our Foreign Office has become too supine. Like the blasted tree in the moors, it has forgotten how to stand up. Ladies and gentlemen, I've skirted over the detail because it becomes extremely complex and very fontate very quickly. You can find a great deal more on the specifics on the Veterans for Britain website, and with David Banks in the back, there's a significant amount of material which we've brought along with us as well to help you get started. Online we have the original policy documents that emerged after Brexit from all the various EU institutions through down to the latest proposals that have been signed off. About the European Defence Action Plan, EDAP, that spells out the policy aiming for integration plus a multi-billion-pound budget. About the Security and Defence Integration Plan, SDIP, that ties strategic policy to working provisions and which the government has said it largely agrees with. About the European Defence Research Programme, EDRP, whose preparatory elements the UK has already signed up to and which is encouraging UK businesses to lobby to stay in. About the European Defence Fund and its slush fund to cover advance payments for joint projects, the Cooperative Financial Mechanism, or CFM. About EDIP, which we referenced earlier, and the European Defence Technology Industrial Base, EDTIP, that is now in its second decade of pushing to integrate giant armaments conglomerates. The Military Planning and Conduct Capability, or MPCC, the new EU headquarters by another, more boring and less controversial name. And a range of proposals to create specific common EU assets and common EU units and common EU capabilities, or to put it another way, a common European army bit by bit. There's one good thing to come out of this. If you're an acronym addict, you're not going to have to go into rehab anytime soon. The one key salient point to conclude is this. For Whitehall to respect the result, civil servants need to step away from the EU institutions, empty their old offices, and post home their espresso machines. They need to understand that the real gravity model with the EU is not about economics, it's about being too close to the institutions and remaining in orbit around their ambitions. For as long as the EU is seen as institutionally a close partner, counterparts will pretend that the referendum vote was not a rejection of the old way of doing business. Ironically, the European Union institutionally is Europe's biggest monopoly and its biggest cartel. Brexit, if it is to have a deeper and wider meaning, means busting that lack of options wide open. That applies as much to defence and security integration within the alternative NATO context as it does to putting free trade Europe back on the table for national capitals. Thank you.